Hey everyone, and welcome back to Afrodo Reviews. On this channel, I help you decide, is that book worth reading over second breakfast? Or does it deserve the fiery pits of Mount Doom? Today's book is going to be Manhunt by Gretchen Felker-Martin. I was recommended this book some time ago, and honestly, I had it on the back burner for some time. I figured June, perfect time to read this book. So let's go ahead and dig into this book and see what all the hype was about. I'm sure with all the positive things I've heard about this book, it'll be great.
6 hours later.
Okay. That was something. Well, I guess I can start my research into this book. I mean, that's generally the nice, easy, relaxing part of this review, of my review process, is looking up the author and looking up the book and seeing the controversies they're trapped in, if any. It's like very rarely that I've ever gotten any. I think, City Bones is the only one, so I don't got anything to worry about, right? I mean, nice, easy, relaxing. Yeah, so let's just get started on this review. Today's book is Manhunt by Gretchen Felker-Martin, published on February 22nd of 2022. The book was nominated for a Goodreads Choice Award of the same year, but didn't win. But I think the important thing about this book is the controversies that the author just seems to swim in. For example, I actually had heard about this when this book came out, being in relation to J.K. Rowling, who at this point of the publishing was in full downswing into a more than questionable views, let's say. So this book takes a few well-deserved shots at J.K. Rowling herself, being a series that's all about trans people, trans identities, and written by a trans author. Seems like a great counter to J.K. Rowling's anti-trans rhetoric, am I right? Only Gretchen Felker-Martin, I apologize, had a lot of trouble keeping her name straight in my head, doesn't seem much better in comparison when I really delve deep into her controversies. Because while trying to research into the background of this book, there was one thing that was really obvious. This book is written out of hatred and for the sake of revenge. Now, I mentioned when I reviewed that Hell Followed With Us that the author mentioned in their own acknowledgement that he wrote his book from a similar place, as a bitter, scared young man, and throughout the review, I pointed out how this both helped and hindered the novel in several places. You know what? I'm going to let you do that because, honestly, this is going to get really, really extreme, and the slight squeaks in the background will probably help things feel better. In fact, I officially owe Andrew Joseph White an apology for this, because this has shown to me how bad writing a book out of pure hatred can really be. Andrew Joseph White may have been a heavy-handed in some of his scenes, but he looks like a master at containing his emotions while writing, compared to the sheer, just hatred that oozes off this book with every line. You, sir, have written a masterpiece of a book in comparison, and I apologize for some of the harsh criticism I leveled against you. I ask for future forgiveness because I'm going to have to use your book as an example frequently in this video. Because, wow, I know it seems like I'm stalling. I am, but you have no idea how genuinely draining it was to look into this author and find out the sheer amount of hateful things she was constantly spewing. For example, that time where Jesse Single of Single Minded Newsletter had to go on record and ask her to stop tweeting violent sexual things about him. For example, like the time she tweeted,
"Disclaimer for anyone who's watching this, these are not all my views. While granted, I think that TERFs and transphobes are awful people, some of these things that I'm about to say are not great. And in light of that, I will be providing commentary after the quotes, just for my own sanity. Okay? Okay. Cis people, fix your hearts, asterisk, or die. Asterisk. Bind Jesse Singal with strong rope and bring him to the quarry at the edge of town. Give him to us alive and unspoiled. Leave, and no matter the sounds you hear, do not look back." I can't. I just can't even with this woman. Instead of cis people, fix your hearts and try and understand the struggles that you endure when your body and your mind don't match up with each other. or cis people understand that none of us are really all that different from each other. We're just trying to live our own authentic experiences, and that doesn't give any of us a right to hate like this. No, instead, your answer is to, literally torture and kill a guy and tell people to just ignore what's going on because this one individual said some things that you believe are detrimental to your cause. Newsflash, compassion and understanding do not come from the same place as outright violence and hate. It's literally just perpetuating the cycle.
Oh, about that time she tweeted,
I know people like J.K. Rowling and Jesse Singal are moral cowards who won't step forward to own this as the consequence of their relentless hate-mongering. But make no mistake, you did this, and we all know this is what you wanted this whole time, you sick, depraved people. All I have to say is you ought to remember how things ended for Goebbels and Himmler. We will fuck on your neglected graves. So for a bit of added context, Goebbels and Himmler were literal Nazis. And while in no way, shape, or form do I condone the actions of TERFs and transphobes like J.K. Rowling, it's not helpful to your cause in any way, shape, or form to make inflammatory comparisons about transphobes to people who committed literal genocide. In the current global political climate, the best thing you can possibly do to support trans individuals is to support legislature and individuals who will provide protections for trans individuals and to do your best to prevent legislature that harms them from going into law. The best way to do that is to find allies who are maybe somewhere in the middle, who don't have, a horse in this race necessarily, that you can help understand the struggle that these individuals are going through so that you have a wider voting base that's supporting your people, the people who need the help. All this does is make those people who aren't necessarily on either side take one look at your cause and say, well, that doesn't make any sense. These people aren't committing genocide. They're not as bad as Nazis. And the fact that you're comparing them to Nazis creates this kind of straw man logical fallacy that will then lose you supporters you need to actually make a difference for trans individuals who need it. As it stands, these statements are purely operating on the idea that any publicity is good publicity, when in the political climate of trying to fight for the rights of disenfranchised and underprivileged individuals, factually it is not. It is in fact only going to be inflammatory and inciting negative press and negative behaviors, which will in turn just make things harder for other trans individuals.
What about this one?
I open my closet door and find Jesse Singal furiously jerking it, his face purple, a belt drawn taut around his throat, with its free end tied to the hanger rod. Singal strangled. A little privacy? Now, Jesse Singal did write an article that was against gender-affirming care for teenagers. That being said, he was also openly against Trump's attempts to legislate against trans people, so there's kind of a mixed bag of whether or not this person is or is not transphobic and what exactly his views are on this topic. What is obvious is that, again, we have inflammatory statements, not only inflammatory statements, but also pretty much kink shaming, and everyone knows as far as the kink community goes, I'm asexual and I know this, consent is key. So you're just literally saying, well, I'm gonna fight fire with fire, except your version of fighting fire with fire is throwing gasoline on a bonfire.
Maybe that time will Felker-Martin express interest in slicing both his and J.K. Rowling's throat.
Blood on Jesse Singal's hands, blood on Helen Joyce's, Rowling's, every just asking questions journalist, and fear-mongering TERFs. You're scared for your children? They're killing ours. If they all had one throat, man. You were so close to being able to make a poignant statement about the side effects of these individuals' actions and the harm that is caused by their journalism and the things that they are publishing, and right at the last second, you had to turn it into an eye for an eye. Has no one ever heard the phrase that an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind? All you have to do is flip your rhetoric around to put the focus on the lives of trans children who are in danger, who are struggling, and whose lives are factually improved by transitioning, by gender-affirming care, by things that allow them to express themselves without having to deal with the mental stress and anguish of hiding from people who do not support their identity. Because the fact of the matter is, in spite of the risks that come to transition individuals, most of them will still choose to take on that stress, to experience the difficulties that come with being a trans individual, as opposed to trying to hide themselves for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, when you're sounding close to serial murderer and Carl Panzram, someone who's admitted to literally thousands of and at least 20 murders, maybe you need to step back and reevaluate yourself and what you're saying.
I wish that you all had one throat, and that I had my hands on it.
I know some of you are dying to know the context of what Jesse Singal did to draw such ire from Gretchen, but honestly, does it really matter with that level of threat at him? I personally don't think this would have been excusable unless Jesse Singal was literally doing the same thing back to her and started it first. If the roles were reversed, as Jesse Singal was threatening to slice the throats of people he politically opposed, or even said half the stuff I found that Gretchen has said to him, I'd be calling him out for this too. I think he's a deplorable person for the kinds of stuff he was saying. If you do want to know, I included some links down below of the websites that I researched into. I know she was going after him because of a article he wrote that was against gender-affirming care towards youth in a certain area. I didn't read the article myself. I got to be honest, by the time I was done researching into Gretchen, I was just exhausted by that day, so. But honestly, that isn't even the only awful thing Gretchen Felker-Martin has done. Like, how she's defended the 9/11 terrorist attacks.
Okay, this is probably one of the worst statements. There's maybe one more I'm going to read that's worse, but this is definitely the worst one. I can safely state that Bin Laden and I did not agree on much, but blowing up the World Trade Center is probably the most principled and defensible thing he ever did. Now, I'm not one of those people who is diehard, gung-ho military supporter, but you can in no way, shape, or form tell me that the lives lost of people who were just making a living, who were just trying to support their families, who were going to work, who were the unfortunate individuals who were trying to rescue people, none of that can ever be conceived as principled or defensible. Because you are not taking the fight to the people who actually are doing harm to the lives of trans individuals. The people on those planes and the people who are in those towers did nothing to trans individuals, did nothing like the TERFs are doing to trans individuals. And honestly, after the other things you've said, saying that you agree with Osama bin Laden at this point gives me the feeling that you agree with TERFs, because you are saying flat out that you support wanton violence like you're claiming that TERFs support. And you are saying that you do not care about large-scale loss of life as long as that large-scale loss of life can be pinned to an entity that you disagree with. Because for all you know, there were trans individuals in that building and on that plane whose lives were lost. And you're saying, it's okay, because they weren't part of my in-group.
Oh, but you know what? She admitted that was just her drunkenly trying to take the devil advocacy against something. You know, we shouldn't hold it against, oh wait, what about this one?
Today I learned that the guy who shot Osama bin Laden brags about it on his Twitter bio. Haha, I put 3 bullets in a sick old man's head for daring to strike back at the country that helped to gut and cannibalize his home. The huge crime of 9/11 is that the shit we do every day overseas got done to us exactly once. Here's the thing. Al-Qaeda, Bin Laden, and the Taliban are all responsible for gross human and civil rights violation in regards to LGBTQ individuals, women, and children that live in the areas that are affected by their reign. That does not excuse the things that the United States have done overseas. That does not excuse the lives lost because of these wars. Anti-Americanism is a fun sentiment that is going to do absolutely nothing to actually make a difference in the lives of the trans individuals who have to live here. And if you claim to be supportive of them, well, I've got news for you. Claiming you support a man who would have so factually hated each and every one of them just because he is against America is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Newsflash, Gretchen. Osama bin Laden would consider being trans haram.
That one was made in 2020. 3 years before the other one. Wah wah. Or what about the time she defends the copious amount of that she uses in her story and actually advocates for using even more?
What I'm about to read next is actually the worst thing I have had to read that this author has said. Trigger warning, because this conversation is going to involve sexual assault. There should be more rape in horror. I'm a woman and a professional author, and I've never written anything without at least one rape scene in it. Cutting it out of the world is like pretending disease doesn't exist, or that people never starve or get murdered by a loved one. Now, I don't know if Gretchen has ever experienced sexual assault, has been a victim of sexual assault. And if she has, I am deeply sorry that she had to experience that in any way, shape, or form. There is a reason, though, that authors tend to avoid rape in their works of fiction. And that is because things like plagues that turn people into zombies or serial killers or masked murderers that come back from the grave time and time again, no matter how much you kill them, those are all fantasy. They are unrealistic. They are things that, you use to tell kids to stay in bed and don't go out because of the things that go bump in the night. They are not real dangers that people have to live with the threat of every single day. It's like that question going around TikTok, would you rather be alone in the woods with a random man or a random bear? Most women will pick the bear because, unfortunately, men are a very real threat to their existence. People in general can do such horrible things to people, and rape is one of those things that is a very real horror for a lot of individuals, and including something like that in a work of fiction makes it way too real for a lot of people. There are some genres in which that kind of thing is not okay, but more acceptable. In really dark romances, the kind of mafia romances that people read specifically for that kind of thing, whether it's trying to work through a trauma or just with the understanding that it's going to be that type of a story, are different from horror that people read strictly as a source of escapism because they know it is so unreal that there's going to be a man in a hockey mask that is macheteing them to death. In my personal opinion, including a rape scene in every single book not only diminishes the lasting trauma and significance that an act like that can have on an individual's life, at this point it feels glorifying to me. I'm not saying that this kind of thing should never exist in a work of literature, but if it does exist, you have to work through all of the ramifications of it, how drastically that changes the character's life from that moment on. And maybe this is a way for the author to work through some trauma of her own. But if this is, then I don't know how exactly anyone can excuse the other statements she has made, the violently sexual tweets that she's posted, because if she's experienced that kind of trauma, how can she possibly wish that on other people? Because it's literally one of the worst things that can happen to someone. It's the kind of thing that it doesn't kill you, but you wish you were dead because you were never the same person after something like that. And making a point of pride to be that you always include a rape scene reads more like you're glorifying it than you are trying to spread any kind of a message or share the experience of a victim.
Okay, so I want to go ahead and go on response quickly about the Neon Yang thing. They were somewhat involved with the Isabel Falls, and what they did was wrong, regardless of if they were non-binary or if they were gay or straight or trans. It doesn't matter who you are. Bullying someone else is wrong. But just because you're bullying a bully doesn't mean what you're doing is right. Alright? I can look at two different wrongs and say, that's wrong, without being, well, that was wrong first, so I guess what this person is doing is right. And I'm going to stop here for a moment and go on record in defense of Gretchen for just a moment. To the conservative folks that are watching now in the hopes that I'm taking some kind of anti-trans view, first of all, you can leave. I don't want you here. Second of all, you can criticize an author and her views without misgendering her in the process. The sheer amount of articles and criticisms I found against Gretchen that insisted on using the wrong pronouns and misgendering her was genuinely disgusting. Knock it off. This is a critique of a person, not their gender identity. In fact, I'm also going to go on and defend Gretchen from something else in this book. Surprisingly, the controversy that I saw most about in this book is the belief that Gretchen Felker-Martin wrote a scene where Author J.K. Rowling is burned to death in it. Well, I'm in no rush to defend J.K. Rowling from scrutiny. After all, the woman literally published an anti-trans work under the pseudonym of a man who is known for experimenting with gay conversion therapy. You ever wonder where the Robert Galbraith pseudonym comes from? Look up Robert Galbraith Heath. Yeah, you're really stepping up for LGBT rights there, J.K. Rowling. But in Gretchen's defense, this isn't actually how the scene in the book plays out. J.K. Rowling's death is only told to us in a tale around the campfire sort of way, and in an obvious allusion to Edgar Allan Poe's Mask of the Red Death story. It's never stated as fact, and it's not a scene we witness within the book, but rather a campfire tale that has survived. While I won't necessarily defend the scene itself, I do think that when you're spitting hate at real people in your book, you're kind of going a little far. It's not as bad as so many news outlets made it out to be. It's not like it's graphically showing J.K. Rowling's flesh melting off her skin while she's tied to a stake. It's a story in the book. It's a story in a story. It might not even happen, kind of thing. But that's all I gotta really say about the author. So let's go ahead and give a quick synopsis on this book. So the synopsis as the book itself presents is... The synopsis as presented on I got it from Amazon Kindle, so I'm going to be reading it off this thing. But the synopsis as it's presented itself here is... Beth and Fran spend their days traveling the ravaged New England coast, hunting feral men and harvesting their organs in a gruesome effort to ensure they'll never face the same fate. Robbie lives by his gun and one hard-learned motto: other people aren't safe. After a brutal incident entwines the three of them, this found family of survivors must navigate... I'm literally reading this. This found family must navigate murderous turfs, a sociopathic billionaire brat, and an awkward relationship dynamics, all while outrunning packs of feral men and their own demons. And that's kind of basically what the book's about. I won't say that's a wrong synopsis. It's really weak, but I mean, based on some of my criticisms later on in the book, it's pretty fitting to what's going on. So I don't think I really need to add anything for the moment. I am going to say this, blanket spoiler warning from now on. I'm not going to be able to talk about this book without spoiling some things. But, yeah, just fair warning going in. Now, as I mentioned, Manhunt was actually recommended to me a little bit before it came out, in direct response to a lot of J.K. Rowling's transphobic comics on Twitter. Someone actually told me this book worked well as a direct response specifically to her Robert Galbraith book, Troubled Blood, where the book's killer is a not-too-subtle jab at trans women. I actually thought it had been out for years, this book right here, Manhunt, but I guess it's only been out 2 years. And those 2 years, I guess I've eagerly waited a chance to finally read this book. I think I saved Manhunt to my Kindle library about 6 months ago. And I was waiting for June specifically to talk about it and read it. Now, one of the first things I should really talk about in this book is that it is a splatterpunk novel. What's splatterpunk, I hear some viewers ask? Well, splatterpunk is what you get when you try to outgore Ruggero Deodato. I think I said his name right. I've only ever seen it written.
So he kills this girl's father, cuts off the guy's face, and is wearing it as a mask while he makes out with her.
I'm just gonna say it, that's not okay.
Basically, it's a literary genre characterized by graphically described scenes of an extremely gory nature. Now, I really wish I had known this before I dived into this book, as while I do enjoy the occasional work that is classified as splatterpunk, such as the original Evil Dead movies,
this is my boomstick!
I'm not exactly a reader who likes to bathe himself in the viscera offered by most extreme splatterpunk's works. I mean, I was actually contemplating for a while making a community post where I joke about how when it seemed like I got a book off a Kindle called The Monstrous Mrs. Mai, Kindle was recommending me all sorts of messed up things that I had no interest in reading. Like Blender Babies. Actually, in hindsight, I got Monstrous Mrs. Mai and Manhunt about the same time, so Manhunt may actually be responsible for this. But I won't say for sure, because I haven't read Monstrous Mrs. Mai yet. And of course, being a cis male, I was more than a little sensitive to the fact that a great deal of the gore in the book happens to come across with our main characters harvesting what they call Easter eggs. Or, in less euphemistic terms, cutting off men's testicles and eating them.
Would you please leave my testicles alone?
To be honest with you, I didn't think I'd use that clip more than once this month, actually. In any case, but honestly, the whole splatterpunk genre isn't even why I dislike this book. It honestly fell down to how this book was written. Now, I will give this book plenty of praises here for Gretchen's writing. I did enjoy the dichotomy presented between Fran and Beth, our two trans femme characters, and the injustice in which they're treated because of how they look. You see, Fran is a passing trans woman, meaning that a lot of her surgery was done before the world ended, and they have a very specific body type where you probably wouldn't know they're trans without violating personal space or being told. Beth is the exact opposite. Most of her surgery was scheduled for days after T-Day started in this book, the end of the world. So she is still very masculine in her appearance. She's 6'2", a big bulky body, and she weighs like 200-something pounds, I think she said. And in a world where someone with too much testosterone will transform into a violent monster, this means she isn't treated very well. Since Fran is passing, however, she's often treated equal to many of the women who are in charge of running areas. This is often juxtaposed with how unfair Beth is treated for her own appearance. Combine this with their upbringings being different, Beth being from a poor, bigoted family, while Fran is from a more middle-class family and had greater freedoms than she did, and we get a good friction-filled comparison here. In addition, the character of Roxanne is a rather decent character as well. A tough within the bad guy's army, we get a decent view into what leads someone, not necessarily, kind of. We get a rather decent view of what it's like to be on the inside of the TERF organization. She tends to fetishize the object of the hatred of her group. She'll line up a group of trans women and gun them down execution style, albeit with some reluctance, but that doesn't mean she won't constantly make stops at her favorite trans hooker's house for a little nookie from time to time. Very Republican senator in that way. Although that that doesn't really, that compliment doesn't extend to all the TERFs who are more one-dimensional villains, but whatever. It's also smart enough to know the real danger of when fascists move into town and start spouting their hateful rhetoric are not the few dozen people who cheer along, but the hundreds who just keep quiet in face of it, or are against it only while their own lives aren't in danger. She also did something really clever when it came to the dead names of one of our characters. Instead of having it just said, we instead get redacted in the text, which had all the same punch of using the dead name without having to actually drop it. And when we do get Beth's dead name, it's a plot-relevant detail. Though, this is also mixed with Robbie's dead name just kind of being thrown at us for no reason at all, so I guess that kind of evens it out to being a neutral point rather than a positive point. I will also give it this one point of a hell followed with us. In that review, I made a comment on how throughout the story, the book seemed to over-focus on the fact that Benji was in fact trans. In these two post-apocalyptic novels with trans main characters, they both basically do the same thing. But it's a lot more forgivable in Manhunt that constant attention is brought to the fact that our characters are trans. Benji being trans was a fact of his character, but didn't hold a strong relation to the larger narrative of the story. He'd still be in a lot of the same situations even without it. The opposite is true of these characters. Beth and Fran being trans is a source of a great deal of conflicts and a main driving point in why they find safety is so hard for them. So naturally, them being a trans woman is focused on quite a bit more, but for good reason. But that's literally the only point that this book is going to get over Hell Followed With Us. Look me in the eyes. That's the last time that book gets complimented over Hell Followed With Us. For example, one of the points I was going to bring up in my review of that book, Hell Followed With Us, was that I wasn't sure how I felt about Benjamin's transformation into Seraph being equated with him being trans. Ultimately, I cut that comment as I felt that wasn't really a point I could comment on properly, and I also felt that I was merely overreading those scenes, seeing a false equation that wasn't actually there. This is not true of Manhunt. Now, I get what Gretchen is going for during her writing of the book. The fear towards Beth and other trans women are accepted by a large portion of the remaining female population, and is supposed to parallel to the reactions that they get today. Most feel that they'll turn into violent brutes who will attack and sexually assault them at any moment, because they weren't born women. I get that. I get that's what Gretchen is going for in this book. But, here's the problem with that. That's actually true in this world. Gretchen wants us to draw equivalency to modern-day trans issues, but by doing that, isn't she also basically saying that trans women will, in fact, go crazy and attack women in spaces that they're meant to feel safe if they don't receive a dose of estrogen every week? Like, if you have too much testosterone in your body, you literally will Hulk out and turn into a monster. Honestly, this whole work almost feels like when someone makes a really bad left-leaning cartoon. So filled with gender politics that are handled in the worst possible way, and they're so high on their own message that they fail to see what they're saying and doing is actually doing as much damage as if they were a right-leaning cartoon. I still remember how people accused Velma of being a conservative deep cover op to discredit left-leaning ideals because of how badly it handled itself.
If there is one thing the internet agrees on, it's that you should never change anything ever. I hope you die. Sincerely, Velma. Well, at least Judy's still white.
It's actually a lot like when I pointed out it in Dead Until Dark. The author clearly wants us to create a parallel for a prejudice that exists within the book and the real-world prejudice that exists of a minority group. Their intention is maybe noble, trying to stand in defense of this minority group, in which case both LGBTQ members, but when the writing it has accidentally ends up saying the thing they're trying to say isn't true, the author has failed to see what they're actually saying in the subtext, despite their intention. This is why I said in the beginning the book was written out of hatred and revenge. It's so angry and foaming at the mouth that it hurts itself in its own confusion. Well, let's also talk about how obsessed this book is with sex and sexual organs. Because my God, is it. I have at least 3 times in my notes just an annoyed comment asking the characters to stop having sex for 5 fucking minutes so we can actually see them be characters. I mean, it is egregious. I think the worst example by far is between Robbie and Fran. Robbie, a trans male, who saves Beth and Fran from a horde of men attacking them, teams up with them in order to help a gravely wounded Beth get back to Seabrook for medical attention. Within literal minutes of meeting our duo, he and Fran are having sex with each other inches from Beth's badly beaten body. Beth, in the previous scene, was Ard, by the way. And I called out The Rising for Brian King for its horrendous use of sexual assault in its book, and how anytime a woman was on screen, there was some type of mention of that act occurring or having occurred in the past. And while that is, to a degree, worse, since in that book it was almost always without consent, there was at least scenes where we stopped having sex for 5 minutes so the author could tell their story. I'll be honest with you, if I had stopped reading somewhere near the 150 page mark, I wouldn't know how to describe Robbie to you. Because for a good portion of the book, 90% of his scenes just involve how he's nailing Fran. Or I guess Fran is nailing him, technically. I mean, like, I'll get into this a little more later. Beth is begging to have sex with Indy despite barely being conscious on Indy's operating table. Ramona is constantly having sex with a character named Feather. We see Beth work as a lady of the night in the bunker she's in, despite the fact that her experience and build should have had her better as an Easter egg hunter over Robbie, who's described like a skinny twink. And Fran and Beth have randomly had sex the night before they meet Robbie because, you know, it's like every other sentence was either the character having sex or talking of sexual organs. You ever watch that one South Park episode with George R.R. Martin in it?
Wiener, 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 next to another.
Yeah, I'm Butters in that scene. It's kind of the experience of reading this book. That basically sums up the experience of reading this book, to be honest with you. And I'm actually not sharing a fair amount of quotes from this book for the reason that YouTube will come down harder on me than the God of Thunder with his hammer. I gotta be honest with you guys. I'm treading a very fine line as it is. There's gonna be a lot of bloops in this. It comes off a lot like, but the book comes off a lot like how authors would try to be more adult just by jacking up the amount of violence in their work of fiction. And I'm gonna go on record. I'm one of those people who does not think that's true. A work can be adult, have dark themes, without ever resorting to characters constantly doing the naughty on screen or violently gutting themselves and pulling out all their organs in a disgusting way. Honestly, I would personally argue that the more you rely on this kind of content to be adult, the more childish your work actually is. It definitely doesn't help the book near the middle. And I gotta be honest with you here. The middle section of this book was a genuine slog to get through. For the most part, the only thing that felt like was happening in this book was...
nothing! Absolutely nothing!
The characters were just doing their jobs, the world was just constantly shitting on Beth some more, and because of that, all you really get of substance is our characters moaning, groaning, and bitching about their circumstances. Except for Fran, who's the only one who's starting to like where they're staying. And I get that it's trying to set up how the society is treating the various members of our group based differently on their perceived gender and racial identities. It really isn't subtle when pretty much every character at one point remarks how much the population of the bunker is white cis women. But just because something is intentionally grueling and bleak to read doesn't mean it's not suddenly grueling and bleak to read and therefore interesting. When you do these things purely for the shock value of doing it, your audience doesn't keep... they just become desensitized and read things like, oh, another... oh, that character's dead. Oh, another... And I gotta be honest with you guys, I don't know how to feel about Indy, the doctor character and the only cis woman in the book that isn't some kind of unlikable fascist, and Robbie, the last remaining male on Earth. Like I said before, Robbie barely gets any characterization through half of the book because it seems like the focus is entirely on the fact that him and Fran are really doing it. But even outside that, it's confusing. Like, he's constantly menstruating. Like, constantly. Every time we're in Robbie's point of view, he seems to mention that he's getting menstruation cramps, or needs new pads in order to make it through the week, or he's having sex with Fran, and she gets, her bloody wings. And you would think there'd be more focus on how Robbie feels disconnected from his identity due to effectively being forced to detransition in a world where being a male is the equivalent of being a murder machine. But for the most part, he's just kind of infantilized for a vast majority of the book. And honestly, it feels like Fran is sexually manipulating him. And I don't know if that's intentional. Because Fran is the kind of character who would do that, but the book itself doesn't seem aware that's what she's doing. Like, when her and Indy actually talk about Robbie and... Okay, first of all, I don't know why Robbie stuck around. I'm going to go ahead and put that on record right now. I don't know why Robbie stuck around. It says found family. These guys are not a found family. I could not in any way tell you why these characters stick together or why they remain together. But anyways, when it comes to that, it's one of those when Fran is talking to Indy about Robbie and their connection, the connection where he stuck his tongue in her butthole. That's flat out told to me, by the way. That's not me exaggerating. Fran literally complains that Robbie won't look her in the eyes, despite the fact that he was perfectly fine. Anyways, Indy tells her that Robbie's been isolated for so long he doesn't know how to properly respond to people and affections. So he's doing what he knows best and keeping to himself. So literally 5 minutes after that, when he tries to leave, Fran is like, oh, but if you leave, you won't get to have sex anymore. And that's why Robbie stays. As for Indy, she's fat. Now, you might expect me to talk about how the Indian woman's name is literally Indy, which was kind of weird when I realized it, but it's actually based on a real Hindu name, so I can't really blame the book for it too much. I still think it is something that Gretchen should have considered a little more when she was writing, but whatever. No, honestly, it's her size I want to talk about, because the book almost seems downright cruel. Cruel. I notice that every time I say this, it sounds like I'm saying cool. So it's cruel, Cruel, on how it describes her and treats her because of her weight. The book describes her as filling out a chair like putting in a cup. Fran describes her as the literal fattest woman she's ever seen. She's a whale, she's a mass, she's an ocean. She won't eat in front of other people. How anytime she stands for more than 5 minutes, her back and her knees threaten to give out on her. How her skin chafes from just daily activities. How she worries furniture can't possibly hold her weight. How the sweat comes off of her. In fact, we see plenty of her own self-loathing and hatred of being fat. And this feels horribly offensive to me. Like, the author is beating us over the head with the fact that she dared to have a fat woman exist in media. And it's not just some big-boned woman, but an actual fat woman. But she goes so hard in the direction of constantly reminding us that Indy is in fact fat, that it slips right back into being an offensive caricature of the very thing Gretchen is trying to avoid. If her size is only supposed to be a fact of her character and not her actual character, then why is it constantly being mentioned? And I mean, I think there's a total of 6 times in this entire book where Indy is mentioned, and some manner of description towards her bulk is not. When you overfocus on such a small detail of a character, you make it more and more that that's the character's defining trait. You want your readers to accept someone looks one way, then describe it every so often. Enough to break any mental image that might be of the opposite, but not enough to overfocus. Honestly, because of the amount of focus that Indy gets, I'm forced to ask certain questions. First of all, I mean, look at me. I'm not exactly a small guy, so I'm not really judging her here for her size. But the situation in which she has the size. Indy lives in a post-apocalyptic world, and while the area she lives in is more post-apocalyptic, in that she's in an area that they're starting to come back to some semblance of our previous society, there are still some issues that would persist, like supply and food issues. How can Indy be so fat unless food is in vast quantities, like it is today? Now, I get that Indy is meant to be a subversion of the fat bastard trope that you often see in post-apocalyptic media. But there is a reason that trope exists. When supplies are in short order, that the average person is kept on a diet and it's typically just enough to keep them going, someone being fat is typically both a sign of power in that community and a sign of gluttonous attitude. A person who's fat has enough power to get far more than everyone else. And they're a bastard because instead of using that and allowing the food stores to go to other people who need that food, they take it for themselves and chow down to the point that they expand. If Indy's meant to have some kind of glandular issues, that's understandable, but the way the story treats it, her size is more of a product of her diet and lifestyle. In a world like this, Indy has to be making active steps to remain this big and then hates herself about it later, but does nothing at all to handle that. Another thing that this book does is that it dates itself bad. There's a lot of meme culture within this book, and somehow the book feels dated even though it only came out 2 years ago. But that comes part of the worst thing that this book has, and namely how its world building kind of sucks. Okay, I say the worst thing, it's really not the worst thing. The worst thing is how the book's written, but dramatic segue here. I mean, for one, I couldn't tell you much about the virus that infected men. Oh, I can tell you about how it would change me, or after a certain threshold of testosterone production, you too could become a raving rape monster. But where did the virus come from? How long ago did it hit the scene? The book seems to vary on that. Like, Beth describes a kid about 9 years old having been born after the virus already hit, as that kid never knew the world before. But at the same time, if that kid's about 9 years old, that would mean Beth had to be really young when it hit too. Not necessarily a child, but in her teenage years. But the book treats it like she's at least in her 20s. I guess she could be 30 or something, but anyways. Why is it called T-Rex? Is it testosterone Rex? Is testosterone... I'm pretty sure there's some kind of medical term that might go along with Rex. Does T-Day stand for T-Rex Day, Testosterone Day, or Trans Day? As the former two are reasonable considering what the virus does, but the latter one is the only one that I remember being mentioned in the text itself. If what surviving male children exist have to go on E or get castrated when they're older, then why are trans such a hot topic? Seems like that's the only way to keep men around. How does, even if you say that they're not women, they are, so fuck you anyone who says that. But even if you say they're not women, I don't see how a population is perfectly okay with murdering them. Seems like, how does a virus completely rewrite human DNA so that when one of the rape monsters impregnates a woman, they completely change the gestation process of new children to only produce male children, to make the mother carry to term in 4 months, after which the baby eats its way out of her, and then makes that same child a mature adult by its first year alive. At least for the love of God, I hope that's what Gretchen meant when she wrote the fact that they were sexually mature by their first year. Why does the virus even give men barbed penises? I mean, I know the implication is supposed to be so that they can mate easier and it doesn't come out as well, but that's not actually why the barbed penis exists in biology. I gotta be honest with you, this is one of those things that I'm a little ashamed that I know it, but that's not why cats have barbed penises, by the way. I'm not gonna go into detail, by the way. Anyways. But at the same time, why would that mutation occur when the book also says the men who are infected basically beat women to death before they have a chance to actually carry those kids to term? So, is the virus trying to reproduce, or is the virus trying to kill everything? All in all, this was just a very mentally draining book that I got so close to DNFing. I'll admit, if I had made some mistakes in my critiques of this world, it wasn't intentional. But at a certain point, reading the book just felt like the equivalent of dragging myself along the ground a path of broken glass and rusted nails. A slow, torturous experience. And because of that, it was just kind of, I wanted to get it over at a certain point. And because of that, I personally think that this book deserves a rating of 4 out of 10.
No, God! No, God, please, no!
I don't regret giving this book this rating, and honestly, the only reason this is getting a 4 and not a 3 is because it does do some things right. There are clear markings of greatness within this book, but they're so smothered beneath the author's visceral anger and snarling that the good is quickly drowned out by the slog that the rest of this book is. Instead of trying to work with the characters and the world it's given, it relies too much on shock value and sexual references and meme references that it'll be outdated and by the end of the decade. It feels like this post-apocalyptic world was made based entirely on a Twitter argument Gretchen had at one point. I still think works like Brian Keene's The Rising are worse than this, but honestly, this book comes way too close to being of the same quality for my liking. I honestly wish I could give this book a 1 star on Goodreads without being lumped in with TERFs who flock to the book and try to review bomb it. So the question of whether or not this deserves Mount Doom is obviously yes. No pause, no question. The answer is yes. If you want a post-apocalyptic world where trans characters struggles to survive in a hostile dark world with elements of body horror, check out Hell Followed With Us. The characters may not be as deep, but at least you'll like the ones you're meant to like. And I want to apologize for Andrew Joseph White for reducing the rating of his book to a 7 out of 10 after my review was written. Please take your 8 out of 10 back, as I was exposed to what your book could have easily been. You have my sincerest apologies for that. As for that, I honestly don't have much else to say. I know it sounds weak, but researching this author and book was genuinely physically exhausting, and I just kind of want to move on with my life. That being said, just remember, with every book comes an adventure, and every adventure is worth having. Even if you're going to be exhausted at the end of it. See you later, everyone.